Let's call the committee meeting to order. This is the schools. I think we'll start out with the roll call, looking at the agenda. Yes?
Yes. Yes.
If we could all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Liberty, justice for all. Thank you. I'd like to go ahead and request a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved. Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, same sign. Motion passes. So today we are gathered here to review the information that we have assembled over the past several months. But I'd like to start out by kind of recapping what we have done over the last number of months. Why are we here? First off, I want to thank Governor Eric Holcomb, who last December called for action to be taken by the state as it relates to virtual charter schools. In fact, on December 7th, 2017, he said, and I quote, "The state shouldn't allow schools that have poor performance to continue. I look forward over the next year with the State Board of Education to help put in place measures that hold schools accountable for poor performance. Poor performance would be putting it lightly." And he subsequently called for immediate attention and action. In May, the State Board of Education sought to establish this committee to look into virtual education here in the state of Indiana, do a deep dive into the data, and what we started out doing was we reviewed all the current statutes and regulations. And I will add that we only have 2 pages of regulations from 2010 for the Indiana State Board of Education on virtual charters, really implemented at the commencement of virtual charter education here in the state, and kind of referred to the regulation of virtual charters in our state as a little bit being like the Wild West. Not a lot of rules or regulations that govern these schools. So this committee reviewed current statutes and regulations. We reviewed the school data as it relates to virtual charter education. We received presentations from every authorizer in the state, operators, as well as schools. We received a detailed Indiana Department of Education analysis on virtual charter schools here in the state. We brought in national experts to testify and inform us as to what they are seeing across the country, in other states, as well as to review our virtual charter education here in the state. We heard from the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, the National Coalition for Public School Options, the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, as well as the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. This committee also undertook a tour of one of our virtual charters, the Connections Academy, and met with school leaders at the school, or at the HQ for the school. And quite honestly, we don't have all the answers right now. We could certainly use more time, and I think as part of our recommendations, we have built in the opportunity, or recommendations I think we're going to consider today, that we've built in some level of regulatory review and rulemaking to go forward to be more nimble about how we regulate and govern virtual charter educations here in the state. So I think, to recap a little bit, and I'll also ask for comments from my fellow committee members. The state of virtual charter education in Indiana is not good. That's why we're here today, and that's why we've been undertaking this review. Performance has been abysmal, and we have seen virtual schools close. Hoosier Academy's closed recently, and that virtual charter school was operated by the nation's leading virtual charter school operator, and also had a very strong principal in place, yet it still failed miserably. So clearly there are many issues that are causing these kind of performance problems, academic performance problems. Unfortunately, all virtuals fell in the bottom 3% for high school growth. I think that is a very informative piece of data. And virtual programs have been in place for close to 10 years. So these are not new schools or new programs or new issues. We just have some real concerns here. And if I could highlight one virtual school operator, Indiana Virtual School out of Daleville, which started in 2011. Only 35% of students took the ELA test, math and English test. 6.5% graduation rate, 64 students out of 985 in 2017. Now that's an improvement from 5.7 in 2016. Yet, at the same time, the school's growth, enrollment growth, doubled from 2016 to 2017. And a new school was opened. And the final data point that I found interesting as it relates to that particular school was that it has a lower than the state average for percentage of special needs children, lower than the state average. So we are seeing rapid growth by schools that are not performing well, and that's putting it nicely. So the way I approach it is, the state of Indiana is investing tens of millions of dollars into the education of students here in the state, and we should expect a reasonable return on that investment. We're talking about close to $100 million per year and growing. So that kind of frames my perspective as to how we need to address virtual charter education here in the state. We need to recognize the performance and also recognize that many of the schools and operators came before us and told us that there really wasn't any change that was needed. All is well, or at least they're doing the best they can. And I think I have to, if I can speak for myself, I think we can do much, much better. And if we can't, then we need to reevaluate the entire virtual education in the state. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my fellow committee members if they would like to make any preliminary comments before we dive into our review of potential legislative and regulatory recommendations.
So I would like to start by saying that I'm a proponent of choice and giving parents a choice. My own children do not attend school in the county in which we live. And so, you find the school system that works for you, and there are parents who, for whatever reason, virtual and online learning is the best for them, whether it's a medical reason or a social issue, or because they prefer that type of education, or they want some support with their own homeschooling. And so I'm a proponent of choice, but I also think that it's our obligation to make sure that those choices are fair and reasonable, so that when parents make that choice, they know that they're getting a quality product for their child. And going back to what you said about the taxpayers deserve the same right to know that they're getting a quality product for the money that's being spent on it. And so there are people who are doing it well, and there are people who are not doing it well. And unfortunately, you have to set up rules and guidelines for everybody, so that the people who are not doing it well will either get on board or get out of the business, because again, the parents and kids deserve to have the choice, but deserve to know that the choices that they will make are reasonable. The other thing I would say too is we did hear a lot of common themes when we met with different professionals, different experts, and so to me that was reassuring that if we were hearing the same themes over and over, there's something to it.
Not to be too redundant, because my remarks are very similar, it really has been a privilege to serve on this committee and to have the opportunity to learn more about virtual charter schools in the state that they are in the state of Indiana. But when I think about choice, that's truly important to all parents, to have that option for their child. They truly do know what's best for their child in terms of their education. And so to have strong options for our families is truly important. And so whatever the personal reasons that families desire to send their students to a virtual charter school, that should be a very viable option. It should be something where all students have the opportunity to succeed and grow academically. And the data that we uncovered was certainly concerning to worry about, are these students really getting the best education possible? And so I appreciate your comments, Gordon, because I do believe that while we have learned a lot, there certainly will be future decisions that will need to be made. But based upon what we know now, I'm looking forward to the discussion today. So thank you for that.
Great. So we have discussed a number of potential recommendations for us to make. And so I'd like to just start with a few of them, and then we can have a discussion, I think, about maybe each item that we'd potentially like to address. And the goal here for us today is not to have a final list or everything written in stone at the end of the day, but I think we'd like to build some consensus that for purposes of the next State Board of Education meeting, we can be in a position to make some recommendations to the full board, and ultimately the board would be making recommendations to the governor and the legislature as it relates to regulating further regulations on virtual charters. So I think the first thing that we are going to consider today is what we have seen is there's a system where there are substantial financial incentives associated with increased enrollment. And this relates to fees, it relates to authorizers. And so first thing I think we'd like to consider is the authorizer statute. And we'd like a discussion about centralizing virtual charter school authorizing authority into a single entity that would be responsible for the authorization and supervision of all charter schools. And in order to achieve this one virtual charter school authorizer system, certain sections of Indiana law regarding authorizer activities would have to be revised, ultimately to phase out current authorizers. So this is something where we've received recommendations as to bringing accountability to authorizers, and quite honestly, we have seen authorizers that are really not equipped to handle the supervision of their virtual charter programs. So we'd like to consider centralizing the authorizing authority here in the state so that there is accountability and potentially even taking out the authorizer fee issue from being a potential conflict as it relates to too big to fail. We've seen one school system in particular that charges significant authorizing fee and is not using that on the actual education of virtual charter students or really for the administration of the virtual charter. So with that, we'd like to, if any of the other committee members have some comments on that, or if the staff would like to further inform us on this particular issue, I would welcome that.
I feel like having one central authorizer certainly aligns what's being asked to be implemented correctly and through one system. That makes sense to me. That would be the way that we would go. So I believe that's a good, strong recommendation.
And I have concerns about the fees, in talking about whether the fees, and again, we're maybe late here in the ballgame, but some type of reimbursement and actually producing documentation of how money is being spent. But at this point, money is not being fed to the students when we're looking at the numbers we're looking at in terms of services provided. And so having one central authorizer would at least provide an opportunity for better oversight.
I guess from my perspective, I have a real concern about the fees that are being collected by authorizers in the state of Indiana as it relates to virtual charter education. For instance, the mayor of Indianapolis, which probably runs the best, as an authorizer, the best charter program, very rigorous as an authorizer, charges only 1% to help administer the program. And there's a large amount of discretion given to authorizers as to how much they are able to charge, up to 3%. And I think what we saw most concerning in the Daleville situation was that up to $1 million per year was being collected, and there was no real rational basis for that as it relates to the administration of their virtual charters. And quite honestly, they were funding their other programming within the school district, which some of it included virtual education for students who were not at the virtual charter. But it created this perverse incentive to A, grow enrollment rapidly, and B, it creates a conflict for the authorizer to really, whether it be control enrollment or reduce enrollment or have strong accountability or even to make the decision to close the school, that's something that is quite frankly not going to happen in reality. It's just not, because the funds are being used, and if they're not there, then that's going to adversely affect the school district. So we can tackle this in a number of ways. The fee issue, which is, in my view, pretty egregious. And I think what we've discussed is, and heard from some of the national experts, is that centralizing authorizing authority is a way to create uniformity in the administration of virtual charter education in the state, as well as improve accountability with operators and our schools. And at the same time, that would eliminate some of the financial incentives associated with increased enrollment. So, I think the second part of our discussion as it relates to this will be specifically on the fees. So if there were not a single authorizer, then how do you tackle the fees? So we'll address that after this. But I guess, is there further discussion as it relates to that recommendation? Anyone from staff want to comment as it relates to that recommendation? Okay. So, number one, there's consensus. Pardon?
I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions for Ron?
Do you have concerns about a single authorizer?
I think we've discussed this a lot, and I think that you all are well aware and are weighing these different interacting forces, if you will. One of the challenges with consolidating authorizing is just about opportunity and opportunities for innovation. But I know that you all are weighing that consideration versus the reality that we have on the ground that you described, Mr. Hendry, around the data that you've reviewed. But that's the only thing I would add, but through our conversations, I'm confident that balance has been fully weighed.
I guess to editorialize, I think the authorizers here in the state have underperformed, quite honestly. And there has not been, I think, the level of concern that the governor has expressed, that many state lawmakers have expressed. So this is not a small measure. We're not going to tackle this problem by taking little, small, incremental changes year over year. We really have to pull in the reins and address this head on. And that's not to say that that everyone will agree that there should be a single authorizing entity, but that is one very definitive way to create greater accountability rather than have multiple authorizers coming before the State Board of Education year after year, talking about how, there's a high mobility rate and there's, high free and reduced lunch student population, et cetera, when quite honestly, and those are actually very similar to urban public schools in the state. So, so let's see. Yeah. That depends. Can you refresh my memory on what is the longest charter? 7 years from today.
From their application.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that.
Right. Well, I'm asking, like, for each of the virtual charter programs, what does it look like now? Okay. So I think that's a very good point, that there should be a phase, and that's something I think we've discussed, is there should be a phasing, and that's something that we can discuss a little bit more about what would be appropriate. I think probably minimum year or two.
I think they
So
need
we're
some
just
time
talking
to-
about authorizers. We're not talking about operators. We're just talking about, the actual authorizing entities that is going to supervise our operators. So it's not like we're talking about closing the schools down or anything. We're just talking about who is ultimately going to be ensuring that that the schools are being run well by the operators.
So grandfathering in or giving them time, but again, then because 7 years is a long time. And so 7 years of not doing well is a long time to wait for someone, depending on when.
I don't think we're talking about grandfathering. I think what we're talking about is a transition.
Yeah.
A transition that makes sense, that
Then
can go
a 7-year
smoothly.
transition would be too long, in my opinion. If someone had just renewed, and I don't know, if an authorizer had just been renewed, and then they now have 7 more years, and they're not, and we're seeing these kinds of numbers, 7 years to wait for them to phase into a single entity authorizer is a long time to wait for that phase in.
Now, personally, I think we're really, this is something that could be done in a shorter period than a longer period. I think 12 months is more than adequate to ensure a seamless of a transition from one authorizer to another, to potentially establish a new authorizing agency, or one that potentially already exists to staff up, etc. So my recommendation, I guess, would be a 12-month. I think any longer than that is, not necessarily necessary.
I think you're going to need to take into account where we're at in the school year and where different things would need to be phased in regards to that, though, also. Because 12 months
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
when legislation, 12 months from now, mid-year may not, so it may be a little longer,
Maybe
but
it's 12 months from the end of the
School year.
school year in which
Yeah.
the changes are effected.
That would make more sense to me, having full school year.
Okay. Let's see. So let's have a conversation about authorizing fees, which is a again, a significant concern of all of us. My recommendation would be that there is the 3% is not necessary, and that there should be some tie to actual costs of running a virtual charter school, or not running it, but overseeing it, ensuring compliance, etc. And that is, again, it's not for operators. It's for authorizers. So, my recommendation would be that fees, and by the way, this is a recommendation that was pretty much made universally by our national experts and others that we heard from, that there needs to be some restraint on the fees that are being charged. So I guess from my perspective, I would want to see some relationship between actual costs and fees. But I would be prepared to propose a top level 1.25% or actual costs formula of some kind, and I think that we could just cap it at 1.25% or some other number, or we could bring in the actual costs and make it a lesser of.
I would, rather than picking an arbitrary number, because I feel like even the 3.5%, there was a bit of, that was the number
3%,
that was just, decided. I'd rather see some type of either formula used or a reimbursement type system used of some kind, so that we have a cap on it. Maybe the cap is still 3%, but if the money's being spent to do it well, I'm okay spending 3%, but I want to know that we're reimbursing them, or we're using a formula that's actually sending the money and directing it where it's intended to go.
So essentially what you're saying is a little bit different from what I proposed, which is it could potentially be a number or actual cost, or do you think it should be just an actual cost?
I think with a cap then on it, but either one I think is reasonable, because I think either one then ends up directing money where it's intended to go, but I think we need to have some system in place to monitor that the money they're garnering is actually used.
I like the idea of a formula. I guess I need more information in terms of how do you figure that formula? What's it based upon to know that the money is directed? So is it about the formula, or is it about guidelines for how the money is spent? What are the guardrails for that money that's collected in these fees, and how is it distributed? So is it more about how it's regulated, or is it about the amount? So a formula does make sense, but I need to understand the formula and how that drives the money.
Ron, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think my thoughts generally on this are the questions that arise, and I think it's important just to call them out, because folks listening will go, how are we going to? And I think both are very interesting ideas. We run federal programs through a reimbursement type system that ensures the appropriate use of funds. It does have an administrative cost associated with it. That is not to say that we can't do it, but it is something that we would need to consider along with this recommendation. But I think there's precedent for this, and the precedent exists to solve a similar issue, which is ensuring that money allocated for a particular use is used for that. And prior to ESSA, one of those key considerations was supplement, not supplant, right? So just similar to kind of what we're doing here, you can supplement the authorizing. We're not trying to supplant general fund. So interesting idea. It comes with some administrative burden, but not something that is unprecedented with the reimbursement piece. And the formula, I think, we need to dig into more.
So based on what you heard, do you think there should be, or is there a basis for a reduction in the maximum fee that may be charged by authorizers under state law?
I think the experts were clear that one of the incentive structure created by the correlation, the direct relationship between enrollment and income through the authorizing fees, was contributing to rapid expansion. And based on the data, likely before these programs are proven to be effective, or even before they can build the systems to be effective. The expansion, there's an argument to say the expansion is inhibiting effectiveness. So I think there's plenty of data and information. The experts were clear that the authorizing fee should be considered. I would defer to the three of you all as it relates to whether that is an overall cap, a reimbursement type monitoring of how the money is spent, or a hybrid system that caps, but also allows you to exceed the cap if you can demonstrate how the money is being used. So that ensures that if it's being used appropriately, the funding is there. I know that there are authorizers, for example, that provide, or historically have provided formative assessments across all of their schools to be able to compare performance across all of their schools with that money. So there's effective uses out there, and so I think, but I would defer to you as to what the model looks like, but would definitely agree that there's plenty of evidence to support it.
I mean, there is, arriving at a specific percentage is a little bit art, a little bit of science. But I actually like that idea, what you said. I would feel comfortable having a cap, but allowing the cap to potentially be exceeded if there's if actual costs were to that are directly related to the virtual charter are are higher than that number.
So you originally said 1 1/4.
Right.
So if the original cap is 1 1/4, with the understanding that they could go up to 3 in a reimbursement type situation, if they can prove that the money is being allocated the way or in ways that are acceptable.
I would probably still push back on the 3%, just because I think we heard from, for instance, the National Charter Alliance. Getting their name wrong. The National Association of Charter School Authorizers. They said very clearly that 3% was, way too high.
But I like the idea of a hybrid. I like the idea of, if they're using it,
Yeah.
if they're providing formative assessments and it's not coming out of the operator's pocket, that's understandable, that's usable, valuable.
So, so I would probably still recommend, a top cap, a certain number. That was the charter school authorizers. Yeah. So the national charter, Ron just recommended that national charter school operators recommended 1 to 1.5%. So we're boldly there in the middle. But I would probably make a recommendation that we cap at 1.25%, allowing a annual waiver based on actual expenses that are directly related to authorizing activities of virtual charter, up to 2%. Sound reasonable?
Sounds very reasonable.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So the next, the next concern, and this is really something that was brought to us by the charter school operators and received a significant amount of discussion at our visit with the Connections Academy, is revising open enrollment laws to require mandatory onboarding and orientation for students who want to enroll in virtual education schools. What we have observed is that that there is a large number of students who aren't really prepared. You know, they've been directed to virtual education, but have no real capacity for making that transition successfully. So we would like to consider, and I'll open it up for discussion, allowing for this mandatory onboarding and orientation for students prior to enrollment. And really the benefits of that would be to identify student goals, educational goals, to identify education needs or support services, including technical assistance, and ensuring that students and parents understand the unique nature of virtual education. It just seems to me that you know, we have put our virtual charter schools in a little bit of a difficult situation by not allowing them to perform this kind of activity prior to accepting enrollment of students. So we want to help these schools with ensuring that that students can be successful. Indiana's open enrollment laws make that more difficult. But we need to, I think that's a point that we need to address.
Absolutely. So when I think about every school that we have in brick and mortar world, that as we welcome families into those schools, as we welcome students into kindergarten, we have major opportunities for families and students to get to know the schools, get to know the teachers. As they matriculate through the junior high, there's typically more activities where they get to know what that transition is all about. And obviously when you go into high school, that's yet another opportunity where there's a lot of conversation and building those relationships. And so when I look at the aspects of a virtual charter school and the difficulties of establishing those relationships, to me are a little bit more removed, and it is a different setting. And for parents to understand how this is different from what they likely experience, to have that opportunity to go through an orientation, just seems very common sense to me that this would be something that all families should attend and get that information to know, are they making the best selection for their child? So this one, to me, for lack of a better term, seems like a no-brainer in terms of a way that families would be connected to what's expected for their child in this setting.
So I think this is one of the things that we heard over and over from almost everyone that came before us, that this was a necessary step. And I don't want to micromanage, this is going to sound like the opposite of that, but you know, when you have a phone operator who then is just going to ask, you know, do you understand and that this is e-learning? Do you understand that this is virtual school? Do you understand this, this, and this? And they consider that onboarding. I think, you know, it's going to be up to the authorizer to make sure that that onboarding truly is an onboarding experience.
If I may.
Actually, you should step up to a mic.
Yeah.
People at home.
Because I think that there are some of our virtual schools that are doing onboarding already, and they're finding success, which is what we've seen in their data, and there are other virtual charter schools that are calling it onboarding, and it's an answering, you know, service.
And just to address that concern, something that the board could address, I believe, through the regulatory process, basically setting minimum requirements for onboarding for all virtual charter schools. You know, having the legislature give the schools the ability to deny enrollment to somebody who does not participate is kind of the first step, and then the board can step in and set those minimum requirements for onboarding to ensure that it is a thorough process.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, basically what we're asking for here right now is that Indiana Code 202611 is amended to link a student's ability to enroll in a virtual education program to the student's completion of a mandatory onboarding orientation training. And our intent would be that the board, the State Board of Education, would issue regulations that would set out minimum requirements for that onboarding orientation and training to ensure that there can be as successful a transition as possible. I think what's, you know, we've heard a lot how the students who are choosing virtual education are, you know, a lot of what we've heard is it's their last chance, or they're, you know, we've obviously seen that there are just significant issues relating to students who are, many students, not all, but many students who are choosing virtual charter education. And there needs to be a very robust orientation for those students. It's you know, the virtual charters are somewhat hamstrung by current law, and I think we need to give them tools to help make sure that those students who are not really equipped, and they recognize they're not equipped for this pathway, that they can be more informed as they make that decision. Any further discussion on that item? Ron?
If I could briefly, I know we discussed this, but since it didn't come up in this conversation, it was something that came up from all the operators, that to the extent that we are going to extend this beyond the student, that we include the learning coach, and we're very clear about that language as to not pigeonhole who that learning coach is. So to the extent that we are going to extend this or the requirement beyond the student, that we use that language.
If I could take a 3-minute recess just to let us digest all that and prepare for the rest of our meeting. Everyone's okay with that? Okay, we'll take a 3-minute recess. Thank you. Percent for each consecutive year of operation during the first 4 years of operation. A new virtual education school may obtain a waiver in regards to enrollment increase, this enrollment increase limitation that is conditioned upon the successful achievement of performance-based goals linked to school performance and growth accountability system. And secondly, as it relates to that point, if any virtual school is placed in the lowest category of designation for 4 consecutive years, the school will be prohibited from accepting new students until the school is placed in the middle C or higher category designation. Comments? Discussion?
Ask a clarification question. The last part that you just referenced regarding the schools, limiting a school's ability to receive new students after receiving 4 consecutive Fs, is that only for new schools, or would that be all schools at any time?
That is actually that's a very good point. That's for schools at any time. So the first part of this discussion relates to new schools initial enrollment, and growth. And really what we've seen is some challenges, not only the poor performance, but challenges as it relates to rapid growth of enrollment. And so we want to control that, make sure that schools that open demonstrate success as they implement their new school programming.
The waiver process makes that solid because if a virtual charter school is performing well, they do have the opportunity for that waiver to increase their enrollment beyond that 15%. So that seems like that's reasonable to me. I did have a question about sort of a definition question, which is kind of in some of the language up above that. That when you have a traditional public school and over what the language is saying is that when you have 50% of their instruction in a virtual environment, there probably needs to be some clarification that that's over the course of 180 days of a regular school year. It's not on any given day that 50% of the kids are. I don't think they'll be confused, but I do worry about that. That, for example, in a traditional school, if you're having an e-learning day, that doesn't automatically put you over into thinking that's a virtual charter school. I don't know, I think there's some language there that probably needs to be cleaned up a little bit.
I think that's a point that's distinct from the growth of initial enrollment. So
Yeah,
why don't we tackle that
separately?
Okay,
Yeah. Perfect.
So my only concern is that as we look back at the data of some of the new currently existing virtual schools, and we look back at what they started with in terms of student body, they started out very small. They certainly would have fit in that number. But now in year 6 and 7 and 8, which this limits them to just the first 4 years enrollment of 15%, now is when we're seeing the boom in size and in numbers. And so
Do you want to see that continue, the 15% annually?
I'm wondering if
without a waiver?
with 15% is fair in terms of ongoing, as long as we have the waiver in process. So there is an option for a school corporation that's doing very well that wants to grow at a more rapid pace. But I look at some of them that in year 6 and 7 have added.
So again, just keep it to annual, 15% annually with the waiver as a possibility.
Maybe within the first 10 years.
I feel comfortable with a longer term than 4.
John?
If I could on that, just talk about how these different policies interact. If you are going to prohibit enrollment for any school that has an F rating, by their 4th year, almost every school is going to receive a letter grade that is based on the full accountability model. So to the extent that you limit enrollment for 4 years, if the school is performing well,
So you're comfortable with 4?
I'm saying if the school was performing well, then the cap would no longer be there, but if the school wasn't performing well, the prohibition would be. So when we think about how these things interact, we might be covered without creating unnecessary burden in years 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
I still kind of like the belt and suspenders approach, just in case one provision gets in and one doesn't.
Can I ask another question then? If I open a new virtual charter school and I only have 10 students, am I limited to an increase of enrollment by 15%? That's one student. Is there a minimum number?
That's a really good point.
Because at that rate, I'm never going to grow to a size that makes it even feasible for me to do a good job in terms of providing enough opportunity for students. So is there a minimum of 50 or 100 growth each year, because again, looking back at some of our schools that started with 11 students at a rate of 15%, they would be the other end of the spectrum and not grow or be able to grow.
Well, in terms of accountability too, it depends on what grade level those kids are, the in size, et cetera, to even know if they are going to be held accountable. So that's another issue on the small end.
So if there were a minimum of, they could increase by, I see that thing as a, they can, if they don't meet the 15%, again, I guess there's the waiver in place, but otherwise I have to apply for a waiver for 2 students because I'm over my 15% limit because I started with 10.
And how optional, how in the real world would that work with respect to a waiver? That's a fair point.
Well, am I limited in my first 4 years to not go, increase by more than 500? Or, I don't know. I just see the other end of the spectrum of starting something and wanting to start small, but then you've actually limited yourself to any real growth.
Does staff have thoughts on a floor that, and a process? I mean, would a waiver process make sense for, let's say, a school that starts out with an enrollment of 100 or less?
So, and obviously this is just off the cuff, and we can certainly discuss further. But one way to potentially address Ms. Wicker's concerns would be that the enrollment caps that we've been discussing simply just wouldn't be triggered until you have a certain number of students in the school. So let's just say 250. You don't have, there is no enrollment, these caps would not, or that 15% limit.
Growth caps.
Yeah, growth caps would not take effect until school has X number of students, such as 250. So that way, when you're talking about a relatively small school, let's just say 100 students, they wouldn't have that same cap restriction in their first 4 years until they reached a certain number, 250 students. As I said when we began this process, really the committee's recommendations are limited just by our imagination and our creativity. So that's certainly something we could build into that recommendation.
At least that makes sense to me. And so until I hit a certain number, 15% doesn't apply to me. Because if I have 100 students, and that 16th student is a sibling, we're just very limited if you're going to have a small number to 15%.
Yeah.
This really ties to accountability, though, and so until you have enough students
For an in-size.
for an in-size to have a grade level to be held accountable, that's an issue. So is the number when you have enough for an in-size to have an accountability grade?
You have to look, is it an in-size just for elementary or high school or both?
I know.
So if we even said 100, I would at least feel comfortable that they have a sustainable number of students. If I open a school with 10 students with a really good intention, I can't even sustain myself until I.
It's going to take a lot of years to get up to
when you're only adding
125.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about a number? Floor? I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, maybe it's 250.
And I would.
Okay. Okay. Moving right along. Better organize my notes. One of the significant concerns that this committee heard was the teacher-student ratios, and just to kind of recap those, currently, according to the National Education Policy Center, the national average for online charters is 45 students per one teacher in the school. It looks a little different, obviously, than bricks and mortar. We're talking about virtual education. But what we've also learned is that the actual engagement with teaching staff is a real problem in terms of low participation and low engagement relative to or in comparison to your standard bricks and mortar school. And we've looked at several of the charters presented information as to their ratio. Connections was 29-1, Insight 41-1, Hoosier Academy, which is no longer open, 49-1, and Indiana Virtual 123-1. So I think that there is a real concern about ensuring an effective learning environment, which I think most people can understand is that there is some kind of reasonable teacher-student ratio with schools. So we have discussed a limit, understanding that virtual charter education is different from bricks and mortars, but there is still and should be some upper limit as to what a maximum student-teacher ratio is. Happy to, my two fellow committee members have spent considerable time in the classroom and am open to consideration. And we also should recognize that K through 8 is different from 9 through 12. So there may be variations in what an effective learning environment student-teacher ratio may be for those particular grades. But I think based on what we've seen here in Indiana at some of the schools, there should be some kind of cap or maximum student-teacher ratio. The number I would throw out is for K through 8, 50-1, and through for 9 through 12, 100-1. I'm open to discussions about whether this is even a good idea or whether we should have this in place, or if those ratios, those proposed ratios, make sense. I think that your average Hoosier parent, whether they have a child or children in bricks and mortar, whether they're homeschooled, which obviously has a little different ratio there, but whether they're bricks and mortar or virtual, that I think Hoosier parents can recognize that there should be some limits or regulation as to the number of educators who are educating our kids. And one thing that we have seen is that many of these schools have ramped up enrollment so fast that their staffing has not kept up pace. So it seems to me that it's incumbent on us to at least set a minimum standard for virtual charter schools in ensuring that there are appropriate staffing in place for the children that the state is paying for their education. So I would open it up to the floor to any comments or questions or concerns as it relates to this proposal and those numbers.
I may have a slightly different suggestion, only because when I think about a K-6 world and a 7 through 12 world, and that traditionally a K-6 teacher may or may not be solely responsible for all the content areas across those grade levels, whereas 7 through 12, traditionally you'll have kids rotating and having different teachers. And so when I think about the K-8 and 9 through 12 distinctions, I'm wondering more about a K-6 and a 7 through 12 distinction because of the number of teachers and the content areas that we're talking about.
Carrie?
I was looking at the same thing because I was thinking about reading blocks and licensure is different from grade
Yes.
7 through 12. And licensure is different. So it would make sense for that.
So,
And the number, like 1 to 50 for K-6, that seems, again, we're saying this isn't perfect, but this is our next best iteration, so.
And the ideal would be fewer,
Yeah.
but at least it sets a mark.
so do those numbers sound like something that you would support?
I would just change the grade configurations to K-6
Okay.
and 7
So
through
as
12.
amended? Okay. So I think the next issue that we're going to address is funding. And this relates to all virtual education. So currently, virtual charter schools receive a reduced amount of state tuition support, 90% compared to traditional bricks and mortar schools. We are recommending that the same funding formula be utilized for any student participating in a virtual education school, regardless of whether that program is part of a charter school or traditional public school. Staff have, Tim, would you like to comment on that particular item?
This, my understanding of this recommendation is really just an attempt to create uniformity across the board, making sure that students receiving the same type of education receive the same type of funding, same level of funding, regardless of the environment, that whether it be charter school versus traditional bricks and mortar school. So it's just a recommendation for uniformity.
Comments?
I just was asking Ron a clarifying question in terms of what was the funding rate for charters versus virtual charters versus.
So to clarify this recommendation, it would be that the 90% of full tuition support applies not only to virtual charter schools, but also schools in the traditional setting and virtual school programs in the traditional setting.
Correct. We have consensus on that? Okay, great. Okay. Okay, so just thinking about what we should cover next. The next point, did we, correct me if I'm wrong, but did we cover the delegation of authority from the legislature? Did we get that? Okay. Okay. So, we'd like to make a recommendation to the General Assembly that, well, under current law, the board's authority to regulate virtual education is limited to virtual charter schools, with no authority to regulate other virtual education programs. So we would like to make the recommendation, as it relates to all virtual education, that the General Assembly revise Indiana Code to enable the board to promulgate regulations that permit that pertain to all virtual education programs. So, for example, if the General Assembly adopts this recommendation, the board could adopt regulations, including but not limited to, as we discussed earlier, the minimum requirements for mandatory student onboarding and orientation, and a number of other important points relating to tracking and monitoring student participation and attendance, how many hours that a student participates in virtual learning per week and per day, whether students are submitting their work and projects, a system that notifies the virtual school teacher when a student hasn't participated or logged in after a certain amount of time, etc. Ongoing student engagement and counseling policies, staff policies such as virtual education, focused professional development for teachers, and additional financial and data reporting requirements for authorizers. Some of these items, we're just not in a position today to make very specific recommendations as to additional regulations that should be undertaken. So really what we're asking for, and some of these points, we would look for the board to enact anyway as it continues to regulate virtual charters, but as it relates to virtual education as well, it should be incumbent on the board to start promulgating rules that will provide for more accountability for virtual education in the state. And this is particularly an issue as it relates to student participation. Students logging in for 5 minutes a day, counting as full participation, is just not acceptable. So this is an issue that is going to take a significant amount more work and time, but it's something that we need additional authority as a board to further regulate all virtual education in the state of Indiana. So that's what we're asking for. Are there any comments or thoughts as to that? Board members? Ron? Anything? Kim?
No, again, this is, I think, a recommendation that's aimed at creating uniformity, so just kind of a common sense approach.
Okay. And I believe we have one final item actually two to address. Tim, do you want to walk us through, are we talking about the 4 years?
Yeah, we can switch gears and go to that. Under Indiana Code, there is, I'll say, some maybe ambiguity between the charter agreement laws and the accountability laws that apply to charter schools, including virtual charter schools. And I think this recommendation, however we draft it, would essentially say that the board's ability to consider options for virtual charter schools and charter schools as far as school improvement would be triggered at the 4-year mark, 4 consecutive Fs, which is in the law, but there is, again, as I mentioned, some ambiguity about when the board can take that action because of the length of a charter agreement, which can be up to 7 years. So it's really just to create some uniformity and some, as far as the accountability laws for charter schools and when the board's action is, or authority is triggered. And again, it'd be after 4 consecutive Fs.
Which again is consistent with charter law, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So this is somewhat thanks to our legal counsel for making this recommendation. This helps clean up and clarify some of the current law as it relates to accountability. So I think we're all kind of in unison agreement on the need for that. And I think there was a lot of discussion about funding as it relates to virtual charters and how the state funding formula works as it relates to virtual charters. And that's something that is clearly going to need to be addressed by the legislature. I don't think at this time that we have specific recommendations as it relates to funding. You know, right now it's tied clearly to enrollment, and you know, perhaps this is something that we can consider further, or potentially as part of a legislative summer committee to consider how better to fund virtual charter education as it relates to participation, progress in course completion, and overall performance. I don't know if any of my fellow board members have anything to add to that point. Okay. So a couple points that we just want to make, not making recommendations, but addressing issues for the legislature to consider. I think the other thing as it relates to accountability is something that we heard a lot is that especially as it relates to 11th and 12th grade, we're seeing a lot of students transfer from bricks and mortars, traditional bricks and mortars, to virtual education, highly credit deficient, and the accountability simply follows the student, and there isn't a shared accountability. And rather than make recommendations as to this point, this very important point, I think it is the committee's intent to defer to the full board's accountability process that is ongoing, and which we anticipate really in the next few months addressing. But so for public consumption purposes, this is something that is very high of mind and something that we look to address as a full board as it relates to accountability. But it seems to us, and certainly from the national groups that came before us, as well as the charter, the virtual charters, in all fairness to them, that there should be some shared accountability model that addresses some of the incentives that are currently in place for traditional bricks and mortars today as it relates to accountability, and students who are clearly failing, but and that's in some ways been characterized as, you know, giving student a last chance, but when they're coming into the virtual education so far behind, you know, and we're judging the virtual schools in part on graduation rates. There is some unfairness there that is baked in and needs further analysis, discussion, and changes. And I think that's something that the full board will be coming to terms with in the near future, in coming months. So I'd be happy to hear if my committee members have any comments as to that, or reflections on what you've heard?
Express what concerns are. I mean, they have a valid concern. They're being judged by students that they are not in a position that they necessarily put the students into that position, and they're being judged for it. And at the same time, schools are not being held accountable for the position they are putting students in. And so we need some equity in terms of that accountability for those students.
I just wonder if it should look different then too, and I think that is part of the full board discussion, that once a child does in that situation, are the rules a little different when they may need longer to be successful. So look forward to that discussion with the full board.
All right. I think that for now is all the, Tim? Okay, yeah. Let's see. Okay. One final recommendation that we would have relating to the board's authority to regulate virtual education is, in addition to the growth of virtual charter schools in the state, the number of in-house virtual programs operated within traditional public schools has expanded in recent years. To ensure consistent standards for students engaged in virtual education, it is recommended that the school corporations be required to create a dedicated virtual school once a certain percentage of students within a corporation receive more than 50% of their instruction in a virtual environment. Any comments as to that recommendation?
I think that's where I was speaking to.
Right.
That's where I would
Correct.
clarify that that's for the course of the school year.
Tim? Just how would be the best way to define hitting that 50% number? Is it at any point in time? Is it on average over school year?
My suggestion, at least for purposes of a recommendation, would be to utilize the language that's in the virtual charter statute as far as defining when a school is a virtual school based on the participation of a student virtually. So I don't have that language in front of me, but I think that would be the safest bet as far as the recommendation, just kind of adopt the language that's currently in statute for virtual charter programs.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Staff, any further comments? So from I think we've reached consensus on a number of points, and I will speak for myself, and then I'll defer to my fellow committee members to kind of recap, why we are making these recommendations, why we think there is additional authority that needs to be delegated to the board, the State Board of Education, to regulate virtual charter education or virtual education in the state. We are responding to a situation where the board has had a number of schools, operators come before us. We've been on the brink of closing down a virtual charter school, and then it closed itself. In reviewing the data, it's just clear that there need to be laws and regulations implemented to ensure success in virtual education. We're not trying to shut down virtual charters or virtual education in the state of Indiana. There is absolutely a place for that, whether it depends on the student or the parents. And again, I think all of us up here believe in school choice, but at the same time, school choice should not be unlimited. We as a state owe it to the taxpayers. We owe it to parents and families, and ultimately we owe it to the school children themselves that when the state pays for education, that there is some semblance of a credible education being delivered. And I think from our vantage point, based on the metrics, based on what we've heard, and based on the near unanimous recommendations from the experts that we've heard from, there need to be some real changes here in Indiana. It needs to happen sooner rather than later. And I think what we put forward today are some strong recommendations, and we anticipate the board refining those as well as implementing further regulations going forward. But it's just not acceptable. As I said before, the state of virtual education in Indiana is not good, and it's quite honestly, it's abysmal. And that's not to say that there aren't success stories, but the data is clear, and we need to be aggressive. And quite honestly, we need to be a national leader. Indiana has been one of the best, if not the best in the nation for its strong charter school laws. And that's to the credit of governors, state lawmakers, mayors in one case. But we have done precious little on virtual charter education in our state, and that needs to change. So we hope that by bringing some recommendations to the table, that we can start a statewide discussion as to how do we turn this failed system around. And I hope that the recommendations we have made will help put some guardrails in place for these schools and operators and authorizers, and bring accountability to those who are running virtual charter schools and virtual education in the state of Indiana, because we have not seen that to date. And we need to pull the reins in and do our best to ensure not only that our state tax dollars are being spent wisely, but that school children are receiving the very best education that is possible. So with that, I would turn it over to my fellow committee members if they have any comments to wrap up.
Just want to thank you for chairing this committee, and thank the staff for arranging the national experts, for arranging us to go out to be a part of the headquarters visit. And certainly we've learned a lot through the process, and I do believe that the recommendations will help move us all forward in this so that we can become that state that's recognized for our virtual education. So thank you, Gordon.
Okay. And again, I would like to thank the staff, which I did not thank, and I thank you, Marion, for bringing that up. Staff's done a great job and put in untold amount of time in addition to their current duties for the full board in helping us get through this process in a very short time cycle. So kudos to you. Thank you all for doing a great job, and we'll continue working on these issues going forward. So if we have any further, I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
That's it.
Motion carries. We are adjourned.
Good.